Palestine-Israel conflict. It is a long-standing conflict, about a century-old issue. But not many understand what really is going on behind all those bombings and iron domes. Today, we will raise questions, many questions, and in the answers to those questions, everything about Israel and the Arab world about Palestinians will become clear to you. So, here we go. Question number 1. Who are the Jews? Do you know who these people are? Jews are an ethnic group. Now, an ethnic group can have identity related to national ties, linguistic ties, cultural ties. So, all these ties taken together give you an ethnic identity. So, they are an ethnic group that originally believed in the religion of Judaism. So, their origin dates back to 2nd millennium BC in the West Asian Levant region. Now, this is the Levant region. It comprised of present-day Syria, Iraq, parts of Iraq, Jordan. This is Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Cyprus. So, this is the Mediterranean Sea, and Israel is today a country adjoining the Mediterranean Sea. And please pay attention to all these neighboring countries also, because they will appear many times in this conflict, because all of them were involved in the Arab-Palestine conflict. So, the origin of Jews dates back to this Levant region. Here, a group of Semitic-speaking tribes resided in the Iron Age. What is Semitic speaking? Semitic is a group of languages which belonged to the Afro-Asiatic family. So all these people, be it Palestinians who resided in Syria, Cyprus, Jordan, all these people spoke a common language and they belonged to a tribe, and the origin of Jews dates back to this tribe. Now, the modern state of Israel, as we see it today here, is the only country in the world today where Jews constitute a majority of the population. It is the only Jewish country of the world. So, what is this anti-Semitism? We've been hearing about this in news. What is this? Anti-Semitism, in short, is hatred against Jews. It is prejudice, hostility directed towards the Jews. The word was first used in print media in Germany in 1879. It just emerged as a scientific sounding fancy word for Jew hatred. The scholars, the journalists back then felt that Jew hatred is so cliched. We'll use something fancy. So they invented this word called anti-Semitism. Although the term is a misnomer, it is not very reflective of what its roots say. We all know that Semitism is a collective word which includes Arabs, Assyrians, Armenians, and Jews. And anti-Semitism is not directed against all these people. It is only directed against the Jews. And against this anti-Semitic movement, Jews also brought a counter movement of their own called the Zionist movement. It grew as a response against anti-Semitism, and what this Zionist movement called for, it called for a separate homeland for the Jews. How was this anti-Semitism used in the Soviet Union? We all know about the atrocities that the Jews faced under Nazi Germany. But what was the response of other countries, other major powers at that time? So Soviet Union was one such major power. We'll study about what happened to Jews under the Soviet Union in 3 phases of the Soviet Union. In 3 phases of its rule. So earlier, Russia was under the rule of Tsars. So under the Russian Tsars in 1880s, Jews had been confined to this region called Pale of Settlement. Here, this was a region in Western Russia. Here, they faced prejudice, persecution. As a result of being victims of oppression, many Jews joined far left political parties, radical political parties of Russia of that time, like the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Then the year was 1917. We all know that a revolution broke out in Russia and the Bolsheviks power. So Russia was now under the Bolsheviks. So when the Bolsheviks gained power, they abolished this Pale of Settlement. But were they really sympathetic to the needs of the Jews? They were sympathetic, but they were strongly opposed to Judaism. Lenin always spoke against anti-Semitism officially, but his words were often in contradiction to his policies. Jews were frequently deployed at the front line of Russian wars for dying and were hardly ever given any administrative posts. So there was some sort of discrimination against the Jews even under the Bolsheviks. Then came the reign of Stalin. So when Stalin emerged as the leader of Soviet Union after a power struggle with Leon Trotsky, who was a Jew, he openly adopted anti-Semitic policies. Now, the hatred towards Jews was no longer hidden in Russia. The Russians also openly adopted anti-Semitic policies. Stalin viewed Jews as pro-Western, who were secretly working against the USSR. So anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union was used as a campaign against these rootless cosmopolitans. So this movement originated in the Soviet Union, where they alleged that all the Jews lacked any kind of allegiance to the Soviet Union. So it was a pejorative term used for the Jews residing in the Soviet Union. So they used to call them rootless cosmopolitan. These people want to stay all over the world, but they have no roots, no love for the nation where they stay. Even the victimization of Jews at the hands of Nazis was denied in USSR. Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign ultimately culminated in the Doctors' Plot in 1953, where all the major Jewish people, intellectuals, doctors were persecuted. This was aimed at total liquidation of Jewish cultural life. So this was what the Jews faced in USSR. So these Jews were facing persecution under Nazis, under the Soviet Union. They wanted a separate homeland for themselves. The Zionist movement keep growing, keep gaining momentum, and there was also an increased sympathy in the world after the atrocities conducted in the concentration camp came out in the open. So the United Nations came up with a resolution called the UN Resolution 181. It is a very important resolution. The United Nations General Assembly adopted this resolution in 1947. It recommended a partition plan for Palestine and the creation of Israel, a homeland for the Jews. So as per the recommendations of this resolution, it recommended creation of an independent Arab state called Palestine, an independent Jewish state called Israel, and a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem. So this city is a very holy city where the people of three religions, be it Arabs, be it Jews, and be it Christians, all claim religious ties to this city. So an international regime was recommended for this city. The resolution also provided for the termination of British mandate in this region. So earlier, this region was a British mandate. The British were also tired. They were unable to control the growing unrest and the ongoing wars between the Arabs and the Jews. They had lost control over the area and they wanted to back away. That is why this UNGA resolution 181 was adopted. Let us see what was the map at that time like. So this was the UN resolution 181. It was a partition plan for Palestine. Earlier, all of this was a British mandate. After the resolution, they created these three regions. The Arab states here, these regions were given to the Arabs. majority of Arabic population resided here, the Palestinians. Then this region was given to the Jews, and this city of Jerusalem was made an international regime. Was this plan acceptable to the Arabs? No. Then a war broke out in 1948. Who fought in that war? The Arabs did not accept the UN partition plan. They wanted claim over whole of that British mandate. So they waged a war at the midnight on 14th May 1948. It was the same day when the British mandate was supposed to end and Israel Declaration of Independence had been issued. So all the five Arab states collectively waged this war. These were Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon and Jordan. Although Lebanon did not participate in the attack per se, but all these five Arabic nations were involved in the wage against Israel. Do you know what was the result of this war? Did Israel lose? Even after the collective efforts of all these five Arabic states, the war resulted in the exodus of Palestinians and a massive territorial gain for Israel. So about 7 lakh Palestinians were forced to flee their homes. And where they went, nobody was ready to accept them, not even these Arabic regions. These countries, they were not ready to grant citizenship to them. They felt that they flew their hometown and they should return there. The right to return of these refugees is still a sticking point in Arab-Palestine negotiations. Then, in 1967, there was another war. Yes, there were many wars that broke out. The conflict did not die down. This 1967 war is also known as the Six-Day War. It was a preemptive war. What is a preemptive war? Preemptive war means that Israel felt that the Arabic countries were again going to attack on Israel. So, in its defense, Israel launched an offensive war. So, this offensive defense policy is known as preemptive war. So, Israel declared a war against Jordan, Syria and Egypt. In this war, Israel had massive territorial gains. Israel gained the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It is a very important resource-rich region. Also, it gained this Gaza Strip from Egypt. It gained Golan Heights from Syria and West Bank region from Jordan. So, all this region which we have this Transjordan River which flew here, and this region was under the control of Jordan earlier. After this 1967 war or the Six-Day War, it was Israel who gained control over all these regions, all these dark orange regions. You can look them here in the map, enlarged. This was the Sinai Peninsula taken from Egypt, the Gaza Strip taken from Egypt, then the West Bank region, which also included the city of Jerusalem, and Golan Heights. What happened after that? Naturally, the Arabic countries must be very agitated. Yes, so all of them met in the city of Khartoum and they adopted this resolution called the 3 No's. These 3 No's are very famous in Israel and they influenced the Israeli foreign policy for decades. What really happened? So after the defeat of Arabs in the Six-Day War, the Arab League Summit was held in Khartoum. So in this summit, the 3 No's were adopted. They said that we will have no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. They wanted total, complete denial of a country for the Jews. They wanted it to be a Palestinian land. So it was decided that all the oil-rich Arab states would give financial status to those who were lost in the war, and they will help them rebuild their military forces. So this was the 3 No's resolution adopted in Khartoum. Do you know how many Jews used to live in the Arab countries and in the European countries? Before this anti-Semitism in Arabic countries, before the creation of Israel in 1948, some 0.8 million Jews, that is 800,000 Jews, were living in lands that now make up the Arab countries. Another 200,000 Jews lived at that time in Iran and Turkey. So a sizable population of Jews was spread out in these regions, and most of them migrated to Israel in multiple exoduses between 1948 to 1970s. In 1970s, the final exodus started taking place in Iran. So Jews were facing brutalities, persecutions everywhere in these Arabic countries and even in Europe. In Europe, before the Nazis seized power in 1933, approximately 9.5 million Jews lived in Europe, which is roughly 1.7% of the total European population at that time. And this figure was more than 60% of the Jewish population at that time. So 60% of the world's Jews lived in Europe and in many other Arabian countries. After anti-Semitism, they all had to flee back to Israel. And these Israelis around the world were reduced, and in the Arabic world, they were specially reduced to the status of dhimmis. What is a dhimmi? Dhimmi literally means the protected. It is a historical term for non-Muslims living in Islamic states. They were given legal protection as per the rules of Sharia. So the protection is the state's obligation guided by Sharia laws in exchange for tax. So these non-Muslims had to give certain taxes for their protection. So Jews were reduced to this dhimmi status around the Arabic world. That is why naturally they were fighting for a homeland of their own. They finally got Israel, and in various wars, in the War of 1948 and in the War of 1967, they also had various territorial gains. But the Palestinians were very unhappy. So there were fightings going on always between Arabs and Palestinians. That is why some negotiations were conducted in the city of Oslo in Norway. What happened in Oslo? There were some accords signed. They were secret negotiations conducted in Oslo between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Israel. So there were two accords. One was signed in the year 1993 in Washington, D.C., and the other was signed in 1995 in Taba, Egypt. So in this first accord, it was decided that a Palestinian interim self-government called the Palestinian National Authority would be created. So they granted self-rule to this Palestinian Liberation Organization. They would hence be called Palestinian National Authority. The accord only recognized interim self-government in the Palestinian territories and not an independent Palestinian state. So the two-nation theory was still not accepted, but it called for the withdrawal of Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, from parts of Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So it was some gain for the Palestinians. And in the next Oslo Accord, that is Oslo Accord 2, which was signed in 1995, three administrative divisions called Area A, B, and C were created in the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority was given some limited powers and responsibilities. What were these? So here the areas where a significant Palestinian population resided, Palestinians were allowed civil and secure self-rule. So they had their own security forces, they had their civil rule and security rule. They could govern these areas independently, areas A. Then in this lighter green shades of areas B, Palestinian civil governance was allowed, but Israel would have security control. Then the remaining area of West Bank was called Area C, the one in blue. it was totally controlled by Israel. Israel controlled security and almost all governance. Only some concessions were given to the Palestinian National Authority. So these were the two Oslo Accords, which were a result of secret negotiations conducted in Oslo. After them, there were another peace summits also that were attempted. In the year 2000, for example, a Camp David summit was held. It is a city in United States. So, in an effort to end the Israel-Palestine conflict, a meeting was held between the US President Bill Clinton, Israel Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat. So the summit ended without an agreement as the negotiations were based on all or nothing approach. All the participants of this summit, they wanted everything had to be settled or nothing. Also, there were no written record of what were the proposals of this summit. After the summit ended, when the press waits for you, all the different parties gave different media briefings that this was decided, this was decided. So nothing conclusive, nothing fruitful came out of this Camp David summit, but it was another attempt towards truce between Israel and Palestine. What happened afterwards in 2005 in Gaza? So something major happened towards establishment of truce. What was it? Israel unilaterally disengaged from Gaza in the year 2005. So from these two regions, Gaza and North Samaria, Israeli forces withdrew. All the Israeli settlements, the Israeli settlers, the 800 Jewish settlers in the 21 settlements of the Gaza Strip were relocated after giving them compensation. So these were some 8,000 Jewish settlers, not 800. And the purpose of the plan was to improve Israel's security. Now, nobody wants continuous expenditure on defense, continuous fighting, continuous loss of lives. So Israel also wants to work towards a peace building process. So that was the intention behind this unilateral disengagement from Gaza. Israel also wanted to improve its international status. So it unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip. But the Palestinian Liberation Organization could not keep control of the region. In 2007 itself, just 2 years after the Israelis withdrew, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority. What is this Hamas? We're not talking about the bread we love from Israel. It is a Palestinian Sunni Islamist organization founded in 1987. So it is a Palestinian. This is a group that was more aggressive, more violent, more assertive than the Palestinian Liberation Authority. It was working for the Palestinian cause, but it was more aggressive, more assertive than the PLO. So they did not feel that PLO was doing injustice to the cause of Palestinians. They accepted Gaza as a donation from the Israelis. So this organization was not very happy. It is an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. It has its roots in this organization, and many countries today declare this organization, Hamas, as a terrorist organization. Though it has a political wing and a military wing, so some classify only the military wing as the terrorist organization, but many countries consider the whole of this organization as a terrorist organization. Now, as we saw that this organization came into being after the first Intifada. So what exactly are these Intifadas? So the Intifada term means uprising. So these were the uprisings against Israel. There were two Intifadas. The first Intifada was in the late 1980s. It was a series of non-violent demonstrations against Israel. So it began as a non-violent demonstration, but then there were instances of violence, and this whole uprising was suppressed with heavy military force by the Israelis. Then Another uprising grew out of the failure of the peace process in the early 2000s. We know that the Camp David Accord and everything was not giving any conclusive result. So a now more brutal, a more bloodier uprising with heavy loss of lives of both sides emanated, and this was called the Second Intifada. Now there is a agency, United Nations agency called UNRWA. What is it working for? The United Nations Relief and Work Agency. It supports the relief and human development of Palestinian refugees. More than 5.6 million Palestinian refugees today are registered with this organization. From where did so many refugees came? Remember the first 1948 war where 7 million people had to flee from their homeland. These people became refugees. No country was ready to accept them. So those 7 lakh Palestinians that were displaced in the 1948 war were not given citizenship status by any country except Jordan. And although the Israeli government recognized their right to return, but they were not given the status of citizens. They were treated like second-class citizens. So the right to return of these refugees is one of the sticking points in Israel-Palestine negotiations. And this United Nations agency, UNRWA, is working for the cause of these refugees. Now there is another UN resolution 3379 that is also very important. What happened here? In the United Nations Resolution 3379, which was adopted in the year 1975, they said that Zionism, you remember the Zionist movement which grew in the Jews? So they said that Zionism is a form of racial discrimination. This resolution was adopted a year after the Palestinian Liberation Authority was granted a permanent observer status at the UN. So the UN started accepting that this PLO is a legitimate governing authority for the Palestinians, and it was given a permanent observer status at the UN. Slowly, the United Nations was getting sympathetic towards the cause of Palestinians. So they adopted this resolution, which was against the atrocities of the Israelis. Earlier, they were at the receiving end of violence. Now, they were deemed to be racist people. But this resolution did not stay for long. The determination that Zionism is a form of racial discrimination, it was revoked later in the year 1991 by another UN resolution. So this was what was the world view of the Arab and Israel conflict. Then what is Hezbollah? We often hear about this in news. Hezbollah is a Shia Islamist political party and militant group of Lebanon. So this too has two wings, a political wing and a military wing. What are they working for? They want to resist the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. We all know that Israel had significant territorial gains in the various wars. So these Lebanese people, they created a group of their own. It is a Shia group. They represent the long marginalized Shia community of the region. Many countries, including the European Union, Arab League countries, they have designated either whole of this organization or its military wing as a terrorist organization, just like Hamas. Now this Hezbollah is very powerful. It has grown into an organization so powerful that it has seats in the Lebanon government. It has a political wing, remember. It has its own radio and satellite TV station. And it is often referred to as a state within the state. It receives military and financial support from Iran and even political support from Syria. So it does not have just its roots in Lebanon. It has support from other countries also like Iraq, Iran, Syria. And this Hassan Nasrallah is the Secretary General of Hezbollah since 1992. He is the leader of this terrorist group. So we see that Shia-Sunni conflict is developing now. But this Shia-Sunni conflict was not always present. Earlier, we have something called Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is a political movement that promotes the idea that all Arabs should unite. All Arabs should unite to form one country. They believe that Arab populations should unite and Western powers like the US and Great Britain should not have any political influence over the Arabian Peninsula or North Africa. So after the Six-Day War and the Camp David Accord of 1979, Egypt lost the leadership of the Arabic world. It was the leader of this Pan-Arab movement. What happened in this Six-Day War was Egypt suffered a major territorial loss. It lost the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip. So Egypt did a negotiation in 1979. It said that please return me the Sinai Peninsula and I will recognize Israeli rule. So when this negotiation happened in Camp David Accord of 1979, Egypt lost the leadership of the Arabic world and the Pan-Arabism lost its momentum. It was on the decline. Then, after the Arab Springs of 2011, many scholars again argued that Pan-Arabism is coming back. So it is just a term used in international politics about which you should be aware about its decline and re-emergence. Now, another question. How many times have Palestinians been offered a state? So, it is not one, it is not two, it is at more than 7 instances that Palestinians have been offered a state, but they refused the offer. The first time it was in the year 1937, the Peel Commission, you know that it was a British mandate at that time in 1937. So the Peel Commission of Britain proposed the creation of an Arab state by the partition of Palestine. Any partition was not acceptable to the Arabs at that time. Then in the year 1939, a British white paper also proposed the creation of a unitary Arab state. This offer was again rejected. Then we all know about this UN Resolution 181, which proposed the creation of an independent Arab state by the partition of Palestine. And we know what these Arabs did. They waged a war and they even lost it. Then this Camp David Accord of 1979, only the Egypt accepted self-rule to Palestinians. No other Arabic country accepted this Camp David Accord. This gave self-rule to Palestinians, but it would have ultimately led to complete independence. But the Palestinians were not ready to budge. Then came these Oslo Accords, the secret negotiations. Then 2 accords were even signed. They laid out a plan for Palestinian independence, slowly and gradually. But the Palestinians were not ready to listen, and this whole process was derailed by terrorism. Then there was a unilateral withdrawal of Israel from Gaza in 2005, which was a very good step towards truce, and it was another missed opportunity by the Palestinians. After this, the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert gave a peace offer to withdraw from West Bank and partition Jerusalem. But this offer was also rejected by Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Mahmoud Abbas. So it is not once or twice, but at multiple instances that Palestinians were given an offer for a separate state, but they rejected it. They wanted an end to Israel. So this was the Arab-Israel conflict in short for you. I hope you've understood it well by now. Thank you. I hope you've understood it well by now. Thank you.
To have more such discussions and analysis, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for notifications on our upcoming videos.